On Christmas Day in 1831, while much of the world was celebrating joy and renewal, the island of Jamaica erupted in flames. What began as a call for rest, dignity, and the simple right to freedom quickly transformed into one of the largest and most significant uprisings of the Caribbean. The rebellion was not born out of sudden anger, but from years of economic suffering, broken promises, and the cruel weight of bondage. For the enslaved people of Jamaica, Christmas was supposed to be a rare moment of respite, a brief chance to pause from the endless demands of plantation life. Yet, when even that fragile hope was denied, something greater was set into motion. The sparks of revolt were fanned by whispers and rumors traveling through the plantations, stories that Britain had already declared emancipation, but that the planters were deliberately keeping it from those in chains. Imagine the fury, the betrayal, and the bitter irony of being told you were free in the eyes of the crown, but still shackled in reality. It was this combination of dashed hopes, relentless labor, and the refusal of even a holiday's rest that pushed thousands to rise together. At its heart, the Christmas Rebellion of 1831, also called the Baptist War, was more than just a struggle for freedom. It was an assertion of humanity, of faith, and of the belief that justice could not be silenced forever. Led by courageous figures, including the Baptist deacon Samuel Sharp, enslaved men and women chose to risk everything rather than continue living under the weight of unending oppression. Their actions sent shockwaves far beyond the plantations of Jamaica. Though brutally suppressed, the rebellion forced Britain to confront a truth it had long tried to ignore. Within just a few years, slavery across the British Empire would be abolished, in no small part because of the courage shown during that fiery Christmas of 1831. The uprising revealed the resilience of the human spirit, the willingness to endure hardship, and the unbreakable dream of freedom that even chains could not destroy. This story is not only about rebellion, it is about the courage to challenge injustice, the strength found in unity, and the legacy of those who dared to dream of a different world. As we uncover this powerful history, we will dive into the voices, the struggles, and the triumphs of those who stood at the crossroads of hope and despair. Their story continues to echo today, reminding us that freedom is never freely given, it is fought for, often at great cost. If you find this journey into history as powerful and moving as we do, make sure to like this video, share it with others who value untold stories of resilience, and subscribe to our channel for more explorations into the past. Together, we keep these voices alive, ensuring that their sacrifices and courage will never be forgotten. In the final months of 1831, Jamaica was a land simmering with quiet discontent, its vast plantations echoing not only with the labor of the enslaved but also with whispered dreams of freedom. Among the thousands who toiled under the relentless sun, one man began to stand out, not for his physical strength or defiance in the fields, but for his gift with words, his ability to inspire, and his deep conviction that change was not only possible but inevitable. His name was Samuel Sharp, a literate Baptist preacher whose sermons carried far beyond the pulpit, weaving together scripture, hope, and a vision of justice that resonated with the men and women forced into lives of bondage. Unlike many who had been denied education, Sharp had managed to learn to read, and with literacy came the power to interpret the Bible for himself, to share its lessons in ways that challenged the existing order, and to create a sense of unity among those who had long been kept apart by fear and oppression. Sharp's religious meetings were never only about prayer or hymns. They became gatherings where enslaved people could speak freely, exchange ideas, and find comfort in the belief that a higher justice existed beyond the cruel realities of plantation life. Over time, these meetings transformed into something far more profound. Beneath the surface of worship, a new kind of fellowship took shape, one bound by quiet determination. It was here that Sharp introduced a secret system of oaths, a network of promises sworn in confidence, designed to ensure loyalty and trust among those who were ready to act. These oaths were not taken lightly. They symbolized a bond of unity, a shared commitment to struggle for a better future, even in the face of unimaginable risk. What made Sharp remarkable was not just his organizational skills, but the way he understood the human spirit. He knew that rebellion alone could not be sustained by anger. It required faith, strategy, and above all, a sense of shared destiny. His sermons often drew parallels between the stories of deliverance in the Bible and the plight of the Jamaican people. Just as Moses had led the Israelites out of bondage, so too, Sharp suggested, could faith and courage lead them toward liberation. In his words, Scripture became more than a religious text. It became a coded message of resistance, offering both solace and direction. As the year drew to a close, whispers spread from plantation to plantation. The oaths sworn in secret meetings bound men and women together in a cause larger than themselves. And Sharp's vision began to take on the weight of inevitability. He did not promise an easy path, nor did he paint illusions of immediate victory. But he reminded his listeners that dignity and freedom were worth the struggle. The power of his message lay not only in its content, but in the way it was delivered, calm, resolute, and filled with conviction that the forces of justice, divine and human, were on their side. On the plantations, the enslaved carried their burdens as they always had, bending to the will of overseers by day, but at night, in hushed voices and hidden corners, they spoke of Sharp's words, repeated like prayers. They clung to the idea that their lives could change, that their children might see a future not chained by the injustices of the past. The bonds of secrecy grew tighter, the network stronger, and even those who had once feared the consequences began to feel the pull of a cause that demanded courage. Sharp himself understood the enormity of what he was asking. He was not blind to the risks, nor unaware of the violence that such defiance might provoke. Yet he pressed forward, believing that history offered no progress without sacrifice. To him, faith was not passive submission but an active force, a call to stand against oppression and demand recognition of one's humanity. The rebellion he envisioned was not merely an outburst of violence but a statement, a declaration that the people of Jamaica would no longer remain silent under chains. By the time December arrived, the movement Sharp had nurtured was no longer just a dream shared in whispers. It was a living force that could not be contained. His role as a preacher gave him both authority and a cloak of legitimacy, allowing him to travel, to speak, and to spread his message without immediate suspicion. Yet beneath the surface, every meeting, every whispered oath, every passage of Scripture he recited carried a hidden meaning, one that prepared his followers for the moment when words would transform into action. Samuel Sharp's legacy was not built solely on the events that unfolded in the days to come but on the foundation he laid in those secret gatherings. He planted the seeds of unity in soil long divided by fear, and he did so with patience, wisdom, and unwavering belief. In him, the enslaved found not only a leader, but a symbol of what could be achieved when courage met conviction. And as the final days of 1831 slipped away, it was clear that the story of Jamaica was about to change forever, shaped in no small part by the voice of one preacher who dared to imagine freedom and gave others the strength to imagine it too. In the waning days of December, when fields should have been filled with the sound of labor and the heavy rhythm of harvest, silence took its place. It was not the silence of rest but of defiance. The workers, whose lives had long been bound to the rhythm of toil, chose the moment of Christmas, a season when society turned its attention toward family and celebration, to make their quiet stand. They laid down their tools, not with violence, not with fire or fury, but with the simple refusal to continue. It began as a general strike, a deliberate pause in labor, an act of unity that carried with it more weight than any weapon could. The plan was carefully thought out, born from both desperation and hope. The enslaved communities had come to understand that power did not always rest in confrontation, but in the ability to disrupt the very foundation on which their oppressors relied. The economy. By refusing to work during the critical holiday period, they sought to strike at the wealth and comfort of the planters. Cotton and sugarcane, those crops that filled ships and lined pockets, could not make their way to market if no one was there to harvest them. In the stillness of the fields lay a new kind of resistance, one that whispered of change and hinted at the possibility of something greater than the sum of its parts. What made this act so remarkable was not only its courage but its restraint. These men and women knew the risks. They had seen what happened to others who had dared to resist openly, who had been crushed beneath the weight of harsh punishment. Yet they also recognized the power of unity. A single worker refusing to labor might be punished quickly, but hundreds, spread across estates, tied together by the same silent refusal, were harder to control. The planters might whip one, imprison another, but they could not easily force the entire community back into submission when the refusal was so widespread. It was a gamble, but it was also a declaration. Their humanity could no longer be ignored. The timing was not accidental. Christmas, to the planters, was a season of wealth, indulgence, and leisure. The markets bustled, plantations prepared for grand feasts, and ships awaited the cargo that would ensure another profitable year. To disrupt this rhythm was to send a message more powerful than words could express. For the workers, Christmas also held meaning, a time when small liberties, time with family, music, and prayer were sometimes permitted. By choosing this season, they were not only reclaiming the holiday as their own but transforming it into a stage for resistance. Word spread quietly from one estate to another, carried in whispers and nods, in songs that bore double meanings and in gatherings that seemed ordinary but carried extraordinary intent. The planters, accustomed to control, could not imagine such coordination could take place under their watch. But the very systems they had built, close quarters, shared labor, enforced gatherings, became the means by which the strike was organized. The enslaved turned their imposed proximity into a tool for unity, transforming the plantation from a place of isolation into a network of quiet solidarity. When the strike began, the shock was immediate. Work that should have been steady came to a sudden halt. Cane lay cotton ungathered, tools untouched. The stillness unsettled the planters, who relied not only on the products of the fields, but on the constant reminder of control. To see that control shaken, not by fire or rebellion but by silence, was unnerving. Some planters reacted with rage, demanding obedience, threatening punishment. Others tried persuasion, offering promises of reward once work resumed. Yet beneath their anger and their bargaining was a deeper fear, the recognition that their wealth was fragile, dependent on the will of those they had long treated as voiceless. For the workers, that silence became a form of speech. Every hour that passed without the sound of toil was a declaration. Every day a reminder that they could resist in ways that were both strategic and profound. They were not simply refusing to work. They were redefining the terms of their existence, asserting themselves not as property but as people capable of choice, unity, and vision. The strike was not a full revolution, but it carried the seeds of one. It demonstrated that resistance did not have to be loud to be powerful, that dignity could be claimed not only in the battlefield but in the quiet refusal to conform. And yet, as the days stretched on, the planters tightened their grip. Punishments did come, harsh and calculated, designed to crush the spirit of defiance. But something had already shifted, even in the face of reprisals. The strike remained etched into memory as proof that the system could be resisted. It was not forgotten, and it would not be erased. Those who had participated carried the experience with them, a shared moment of courage that would inspire future generations. The Christmas strike was a story of silence that spoke louder than words, of courage born not in battle but in unity, of ordinary people daring to confront extraordinary oppression in the only way they could. It was a reminder that history is not only shaped by the loudest voices or the grandest events, but also by the quiet, determined choices of those who refuse to be broken. In that stillness lay the beginning of a different kind of freedom, one that would echo long after the fields had resumed their rhythm. The movement that began with whispers of hope and determination soon spiraled into a storm that could no longer be contained. What started as quiet planning among the enslaved men and women, huddled in secrecy and driven by a vision of freedom, erupted into a sweeping uprising that shook the foundations of the plantations. The night sky glowed with the orange hue of flames as great houses and fields, once symbols of wealth and control, became engulfed in fire. The plantations, which had long stood as monuments to oppression, were consumed, their crops reduced to ashes, leaving behind a landscape scarred yet momentarily liberated from the symbols of authority. The revolt surged like a wave, gathering momentum as those who had endured silence for too long finally found their voices and their courage in the face of immense danger. Overseers who had once walked the fields with whips and commands were suddenly the targets of the very people they had tried to subjugate. And the tables turned with a swiftness that startled even the rebels themselves. The uprising carried within it both fury and desperation, for the enslaved understood that their chances of long-term success were slim, yet they could no longer accept a life bound by chains. Each torch set to a field of sugarcane or cotton was not merely an act of destruction but a declaration, a refusal to continue feeding the system that thrived on their suffering. Each step forward into the night was fraught with peril, but it was also filled with the intoxicating taste of resistance, however fleeting it might prove to be. For the first time, many of these men and women saw their oppressors not as untouchable masters, but as vulnerable humans. Startled and thrown into disarray, the land itself seemed to echo the cries of defiance, smoke rising into the heavens as if to carry their message further than their voices ever could. Though their numbers were growing, the rebels knew the risks. The colonial authorities would not stand idle, and reinforcements would surely arrive. But in those charged hours, with fire lighting their path and adrenaline coursing through their veins, they pressed on with a force born of centuries of endurance. Families who had been torn apart by bondage now marched together, bound not by ownership but by shared purpose, carrying with them the hope that their actions might ignite something larger, something unstoppable. The destruction of crops was more than an attack on property, it was an attempt to starve the machinery of exploitation itself, to weaken the foundations upon which the planters had built their power. As the revolt spread, the air grew thick with smoke and fear. Some plantations stood abandoned, their owners fleeing into the night, their wealth reduced to smoldering ruins. For the enslaved, each burning field symbolized a piece of their own burden cast away, a reclaiming of land that had long denied them even the right to call their own bodies free. Every act of defiance stitched together a collective story of resistance. One that, though destined to face immense suppression, would not be forgotten. In this, the rebels carved out a brief glimpse of what freedom could feel like. Unshackled, unafraid, moving as a force united against a system that sought to erase their humanity. The violent turn of the movement was not simply chaos for its own sake, but the inevitable eruption of long-suppressed rage and yearning. For generations, silence had been enforced with threats and punishments. But in that moment, silence was shattered forever. The revolt was a testament to the human spirit's refusal to accept domination indefinitely. A signal to all who watched that no system built on oppression could remain unchallenged. And though the fires would eventually be extinguished, the memory of that night of the flames, the cries, the sudden reversal of roles would linger as proof that resistance was possible. This was not just the story of crops burned or overseers struck down, but of people who had been pushed to the edge and finally decided to fight back, even against impossible odds. It was the story of courage and desperation woven together, of an oppressed community rising as one to demand a dignity long denied. In those hours, every ember and every act of defiance carried forward a legacy that would echo through history, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the fire of freedom could never be fully extinguished. In the late 1830s, Jamaica was a land simmering with tension. The island was home to nearly 300,000 enslaved people, bound to plantations that fueled the wealth of Britain's empire. Yet beneath the veneer of order lay an undercurrent of defiance, and in 1831 that defiance erupted with unprecedented force. What began as whispered discussions in fields and clandestine gatherings in small chapels swelled into a movement that shook the foundations of the colonial system. It was not the act of a few desperate men, but rather the coordinated determination of tens of thousands who believed that change could no longer wait. The uprising, often remembered as the Baptist War or Sam Sharp's Rebellion, was unlike anything the British Caribbean had ever witnessed. Its scale alone made it extraordinary. Out of Jamaica's 300,000 enslaved population, around 60,000 rose to action, making it one of the largest revolts in the history of the British Empire. Such numbers were not simply the product of anger but of careful planning and a shared vision. Leaders like Sam Sharp, a literate preacher influenced by Christian teachings, framed the struggle not as reckless violence but as a fight for justice and dignity. Through church networks and night meetings, he spread the conviction that freedom was not a distant dream, but a right that could be claimed. When the revolt broke out in December 1831, it began with an organized strike. Fields were left untouched, cane was not cut, and the machinery of plantation life ground to a halt. The intention was not to destroy but to pressure. Yet as the days passed and plantation owners responded with force, the movement evolved into a full-scale rebellion. Fires lit up the Jamaican hillsides, symbols of defiance that also spread panic among planters. The courage it took to resist in this way cannot be overstated. Each act of refusal carried the risk of brutal retribution. Yet thousands pressed forward, sustained by the hope that collective action could achieve what individual resistance never could. The sheer scale of participation forced Britain to take notice. No longer could the system be justified as stable or sustainable when tens of thousands risked everything to challenge it. Reports flowed back to London describing the chaos, the destruction of estates, and the massive mobilization of enslaved workers. The uprising was crushed after weeks of fighting, but it left scars that could not be hidden. Hundreds were executed, and many more suffered harsh punishments. Still, the rebellion had revealed an undeniable truth. The system of bondage was no longer tenable. The aftermath reshaped the conversation about slavery in Britain. The island's planters tried to portray the revolt as proof that emancipation would bring only chaos. But abolitionists argued the opposite, that the very fact so many had risen together was evidence of the deep injustice at the heart of the system. Public opinion in Britain began to shift more decisively. News of the revolt, coupled with the testimonies of missionaries and reformers, created pressure that Parliament could not ignore. Within a few short years, the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 was passed, marking the beginning of the end of Britain's slave economy. At the heart of this story lies the courage of ordinary men and women who chose to resist despite overwhelming odds. Their uprising was not a spontaneous outburst but a calculated declaration that life in bondage was no life at all. The 60,000 who joined the cause turned the island into a stage where the battle for freedom could no longer be silenced. They were farmers, artisans, mothers, fathers, people who knew the risks but stepped into history nonetheless. Looking back, the rebellion stands as both a tragedy and a triumph. It was tragic in the sense of the suffering endured, the lives lost, and the reprisals that followed. Yet it was also triumphant because it shattered illusions of control and forced the empire to confront its contradictions. Freedom, when it came, was not a gift bestowed from above, but a right demanded from below, earned by the sacrifices of those who dared to rise in unison. The story of Jamaica's great uprising reminds us that change is rarely smooth or gentle. It emerges from the clash between injustice and the human spirit's relentless pursuit of dignity. The 60,000 who took part did more than ignite fires on plantations. They lit a path toward liberation that would echo far beyond the Caribbean. Their legacy lives not only in the abolition of slavery, but in the enduring truth that courage and unity can bend the course of history, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The uprising that erupted across Jamaica sent shockwaves through the colony, a defiance that threatened the fragile balance of power and unsettled those who had long believed they controlled every corner of the island. In response, the British authorities moved quickly, mobilizing every resource at their disposal to quell the spreading flames of resistance. Regular British troops stationed on the island were deployed first, men trained for battle and disciplined in the methods of empire. But they soon realized the challenge before them was not one of straightforward confrontation. The rebels did not form neat lines on an open battlefield. They knew the land, the dense forests and rugged hills, and they moved with speed and secrecy, striking unexpectedly before vanishing into the night. To meet this elusive enemy, the colonial government called upon local militias, men drawn from the settler population who knew the plantations, the villages, and the countryside where the fighting played out. These militias were not professional soldiers, but they carried a fierce determination to defend their livelihoods and families. Driven by fear of what might happen if the rebellion succeeded, perhaps the most striking decision made by the authorities was to turn to the Maroons, communities of formerly escaped slaves who had carved out their freedom generations earlier by waging their own wars against the British. Living in fortified settlements hidden deep within the mountains, the Maroons had won treaties that guaranteed them autonomy in exchange for promises to aid the colonial government in times of crisis. Now, those treaties were tested. The Maroons, familiar with the same guerrilla tactics employed by the rebels, became invaluable allies. Their hunters' instincts, their unmatched knowledge of the forests, and their ability to track movements across terrain that confounded outsiders made them a decisive force in the campaign. For some of the Maroons, aiding the British was not just a matter of honoring old agreements, but also a way of preserving the hard-fought independence their ancestors had secured, ensuring that their communities would not be swept into the chaos of a prolonged rebellion. The cooperation of these three groups, regular troops, militias, and Maroons, created a web of pressure that slowly tightened around the insurgents. British commanders developed a strategy that blended conventional force with relentless pursuit, dispatching columns of soldiers to flush out rebels from hiding places while militias secured villages and plantations against sudden raids. The Maroons, meanwhile, moved ahead of the columns, silent shadows in the undergrowth, tracking, surrounding, and cutting off routes of escape to the rebels who had once found safety in the forests. The sudden appearance of Maroon fighters was a bitter reminder that the very tactics they relied on could now be turned against them. As weeks stretched into months, the struggle became less about open confrontation and more about attrition, a contest of endurance in which the rebels were pushed further into the mountains, isolated and cut off from supplies. Villages that had offered shelter faced retribution, and food stores were confiscated or destroyed to weaken the resistance. The rebellion that had once promised a sweeping transformation of the island now faced the grinding pressure of a coordinated campaign designed to exhaust and contain it. Yet even in the face of overwhelming odds, the determination of those who resisted could not be dismissed. Their struggle carried the weight of generations, refusal to accept subjugation, and their very survival under such relentless pursuit became a statement of defiance. The presence of the Maroons added a complex layer to the story. Here were communities who had once been symbols of unbreakable resistance, now standing on the other side of the battlefield. To some, this alliance with the British appeared as betrayal, but to the Maroons it was a necessity, a means of survival in a world where fragile autonomy could be erased by one ill-considered choice. They had fought their war and secured their place, and now they guarded it fiercely. Even if that meant confronting those whose struggle mirrored their own, history often judges such decisions harshly. But in the moment, survival outweighed sentiment, and the Maroons understood the delicate balance of power in which they lived. The British, ever pragmatic, recognized the value of the Maroons and leaned heavily on their support, granting them considerable influence during the campaign. With every rebel stronghold discovered and dismantled, the Maroons reinforced their reputation as indispensable allies. The militias, too, gained a hardened edge through months of skirmishes, while the regular troops brought discipline and coordination that prevented the campaign from devolving into chaos. Together, this uneasy alliance of empire, settlers, and former rebels turned allies created a formidable machine that slowly but inexorably broke the back of the uprising. By the end, the rebellion lay smothered under the weight of combined force. Yet the story did not end simply with suppression. The alliances forged, the betrayals felt, and the lessons learned would echo long after the smoke cleared. For the British, the rebellion underscored the fragility of their rule and the constant threat that lay beneath the surface of plantation life. For the militias, it was a baptism of fire that confirmed both their vulnerability and their dependence on imperial power. And for the Maroons, it was another chapter in the delicate dance of survival, where loyalty to treaties and protection of their freedom outweighed sympathy for others still bound in chains. The island carried forward the memory of that time, a tale of resistance and repression, of unlikely alliances and bitter ironies. The deployment of troops, militias, and Maroons was more than a military maneuver. It was a reflection of the complex and layered society that Jamaica had become, where freedom and oppression coexisted uneasily, and where every choice carried consequences that stretched far beyond the battlefield. The rebellion had been contained, but the questions it raised about power, justice, and survival would continue to haunt the island for generations to come. The uprising did not unfold like a traditional battle where two armies faced each other in open fields. Instead, it became a contest of endurance, wit, and determination, shaped by the environment and the spirit of those who rose against oppression. The rebels knew that they could not hope to match the colonial militias in terms of numbers or firepower, but what they lacked in weapons they compensated for with ingenuity. They relied on their understanding of the landscape. Swamps, forests, and hidden trails became both shield and sword. Their movements were fluid, their presence elusive, and their tactics drew inspiration from the natural rhythms of the land itself. Nightfall offered them cover, and dawn brought opportunities for sudden ambushes. A patrol of colonial soldiers might march confidently along a road only to find themselves startled by a sudden strike from the tree line, where rebels had lain in wait. After releasing a burst of energy in the attack, the rebels would vanish into the wilderness, leaving confusion and fear in their wake. To the colonial forces, it felt as though they were fighting shadows, an enemy that appeared and disappeared without warning. These moments of disruption weakened morale and created an atmosphere of uncertainty, where every rustle of leaves or distant shout could signal the beginning of another surprise encounter. The colonists, however, were determined not to be undermined by these tactics. They brought with them weapons forged in Europe, tools of war designed for precision and lethality. Their muskets and artillery gave them the power to respond with overwhelming force, and they were quick to retaliate whenever a raid struck too close to their strongholds. Retaliation was not only military but psychological. intended to intimidate as much as to defeat. Villages suspected of harboring sympathizers could be subject to harsh punishments. And the message was clear. Resistance would be met with uncompromising strength. Yet the more the colonists pressed, the more the rebels adapted. In the dense undergrowth, their knowledge of hidden waterways, narrow paths, and natural barriers gave them an edge no imported army manual could replicate. They moved swiftly where the colonial militias stumbled, burdened by heavy gear and a lack of familiarity with the terrain. In one account, a group of rebels is said to have used marshlands to their advantage, luring colonial troops into muddy ground where movement became slow and exhausting, then striking decisively before retreating to higher ground. These encounters showed that the struggle was not only about weapons, but about resilience and the ability to bend the environment to one's will. The clash between these two approaches, guerrilla defiance on one side and organized military dominance on the other, turned the land itself into an active participant in the story. Forests that once seemed like neutral spaces became battlegrounds filled with echoes of pursuit and retreat. Rivers that provided water for daily life transformed into barriers and escape routes. Even the climate played a role, with heat and storms complicating colonial campaigns while offering rebels moments to regroup and recover. The struggle was brutal not only because of the violence, but because of the uncertainty it created. For every successful ambush by the rebels, there was a swift and merciless counterstrike. The colonists' superior weaponry meant that when they caught their opponents in open ground, the balance tipped sharply in their favor. This dynamic created an ongoing cycle. Surprise attacks sparked retaliation, which in turn fueled further resistance. The rebels' determination to continue despite mounting challenges became a testament to their cause, while the colonists' ability to marshal resources and respond with force underscored the imbalance of power. What emerged was not simply a clash of weapons but a struggle of wills. The rebels understood that every attack, no matter how small, carried symbolic weight. Each disruption was proof that the colonial order was not invincible. On the other hand, the colonists fought to maintain not only control but also the perception of control, knowing that the mere idea of vulnerability could inspire others to rise. This battle of perception was as vital as the physical conflict, and it kept both sides locked in a tense contest where neither could afford to relent. As the weeks stretched into months, stories of courage, endurance, and sacrifice circulated among those who lived through the turmoil. For the rebels, these tales became a source of inspiration, reminders that even in the face of overwhelming odds, resistance was possible. For the colonists, they served as warnings, reminders that beneath the surface of order lay a current of defiance that could never be fully extinguished. In this way, the conflict grew larger than the battles themselves. It became part of a legacy, shaping how future generations would understand the balance between power and resistance, fear and resilience, domination and defiance. The memory of these events did not fade quickly, for they revealed a truth that resonated across time, that struggle often takes the form of an uneven contest, where one side wields weapons and authority, while the other clings to resourcefulness, hope, and the will to fight another day. And though the outcome may have seemed inevitable to the colonists with their superior arms, the spirit of resistance, nurtured in the shadows of forests and sustained by surprise and courage, carved its own indelible place in history. The rebellion stretched on for 11 tense and turbulent days, becoming one of the most prolonged uprisings of its kind in early America. It began with sparks of desperation and hope, as word spread among enslaved communities that a chance for liberation had arrived. In whispers carried through fields, cabins, and night gatherings, the promise of freedom united men and women who had long endured unbearable hardship. They moved with a shared vision, believing that the strength of their numbers and the righteousness of their cause could overturn the order that had chained them for generations. At first, the rebellion surged with momentum. Plantations trembled as groups of rebels gathered weapons, food, and courage, pushing forward with determination. They were not simply fighting against a system. They were fighting for the possibility of dignity, autonomy, and a world where their children might live unbound. Every step carried both danger and promise, and though fear was ever present, it was overshadowed by an unrelenting thirst for justice. As the days passed, the conflict grew harsher, militias were formed, and local authorities responded with an intensity that revealed both their fear and their desire to crush the insurrection swiftly. Yet the rebels did not falter easily. They fought not only with what few weapons they could seize, but also with the courage born of lifetimes of suffering. Villages and towns buzzed with rumors, uncertainty, and panic. For some, it was a story of terror and chaos. For others, it was a story of extraordinary defiance, a statement that no human spirit could be entirely subdued. Families hid or fled, fields went untended, and the social order that had once appeared so secure now teetered precariously. But the imbalance of power was impossible to ignore. Local forces grew stronger, reinforced by armed settlers and militias determined to restore control. Slowly, the rebels were driven back, cornered, and overwhelmed. The fight that had once surged with energy began to fragment. As exhaustion, hunger, and relentless pursuit took their toll. Still, many continued to resist even in the face of certain defeat, unwilling to surrender their dreams so easily. The determination to keep pushing, to keep standing even when the outcome seemed clear, revealed the depth of their resolve. By the time the last of the rebellion had been crushed, the toll was staggering. More than 200 enslaved individuals had lost their lives during the struggle. 14 whites were also killed, a stark reminder of the rebellion's intensity and the level of fear it created among those in power. The aftermath was equally grim. Retribution came swiftly and brutally, with hundreds of rebels captured, executed, or subjected to harsh punishment. Those who had dared to stand up and demand freedom were made into examples, as the authorities sought to warn others that resistance would only lead to destruction. Yet even in these grim reprisals, the spirit of defiance refused to vanish entirely. The rebellion had planted a seed, reminding both the oppressors and the oppressed that the yearning for liberty could never be extinguished. The 11 days of upheaval left scars across the land, but they also left a legacy. It was a chapter written in fire and blood, but also in courage and the undying desire for self-determination. For the enslaved, it was a story carried quietly in memory, whispered in songs, and remembered in silence as proof that their struggle for freedom was not in vain. For those who wielded power, it was a warning that their world rested on fragile foundations, and that the human spirit could rise against even the most entrenched systems. Though the rebellion ended in devastation, it was not a failure in the deepest sense. Its memory endured as a symbol of resistance, a reminder that those who had been forced into bondage still found ways to assert their humanity. It revealed to the world that even under the harshest conditions, the dream of liberty was alive, powerful, and dangerous to those who sought to deny it. Across the generations that followed, echoes of this uprising would continue to inspire others, connecting one struggle for justice to the next, weaving a thread through history that could not be cut. In the end, the rebellion's 11 days were more than a fleeting episode of violence. They were a testament to the strength of the human spirit, a story of sacrifice and hope, of lives lost but meaning gained. It was a reminder that freedom, once imagined, becomes an unstoppable force, and that even in defeat, those who dared to rise left behind a legacy of courage that would speak across centuries. Their fight was not forgotten. It became part of the larger story of resistance, shaping the course of history and inspiring the battles yet to come. In the spring of 1832, the weight of history seemed to press down upon Jamaica. The echoes of rebellion had not yet faded when Samuel Sharp, the man who had dared to imagine freedom and organize his people to rise against their oppressors, was taken into custody. His capture was not simply the silencing of one man, but an attempt to extinguish the flame of defiance that had swept across the island. Yet, instead of crushing the spirit of resistance, Sharp's fate became the very heartbeat of a story that would outlive his final breath. Sharp was not a soldier in the conventional sense. He carried no sword nor commanded great armies. But he possessed a vision that was sharper than any weapon. He believed deeply in the promise of human dignity and used the only tools available to him: his words, his influence, and his unwavering faith. As a Baptist deacon, he was trusted within his community, and his sermons blended scripture with the hope of liberation, weaving together faith and freedom into a tapestry that inspired his followers. By the time the rebellion erupted, he had already planted in the hearts of thousands the idea that they were destined for more than chains. When Sharp was brought to trial after the uprising, the proceedings were more than a judgment of law. They were a public display meant to reassert control. Yet even in the courtroom, stripped of authority and bound by the machinery of colonial power, Sharp did not appear defeated. Witnesses described him as calm, articulate, and steady, speaking not with bitterness but with clarity about his belief that freedom was a right, not a privilege to be granted by those in power. The trial became a stage on which Sharp, though accused and condemned, transformed into a symbol of moral courage. The sentence handed down was inevitable in a system determined to make an example of him. In May 1832, Sharp faced execution, a fate designed to warn others who might dare to follow his path. But as he walked to the gallows, he carried with him the quiet dignity of a man whose life had already transcended the reach of his oppressors. His final words were said to affirm his belief that he would rather die upon the gallows than live in slavery. To those who witnessed that moment, his courage carved itself into memory, and his death marked not the end of a rebellion, but the beginning of a legend. What followed was perhaps more powerful than the rebellion itself. News of Sharp's death spread far beyond the sugar estates and plantations, reaching ears across the island and eventually echoing throughout the British Empire. To some, he was painted as a dangerous instigator, but to many others, especially the enslaved and those who sympathized with the cause of freedom, he became a hero. His story crossed the boundaries of class and color, slowly weaving itself into the growing movement that questioned not only the morality, but also the sustainability of slavery. The memory of Sharp's sacrifice proved unshakable. In the years that followed, debates in Britain grew louder, fueled in part by the knowledge that Jamaica had produced leaders like him who were willing to pay the ultimate price for liberty. The Baptist War, though brutally suppressed, had revealed the truth that slavery was not a stable system but a fragile construct held together by violence, fear, and injustice. Sharp's name was invoked as proof that people would not remain silent forever. He became both a caution to those who defended the old order and a beacon to those who sought to dismantle it. By the time the British Parliament passed the Abolition Act in 1833, leading to the emancipation of enslaved people across the empire, Sharp's sacrifice was remembered as one of the sparks that ignited change. Though he did not live to see the transformation he longed for, his vision found life in the freedom eventually granted to thousands. His role in history was no longer confined to that of a rebel leader. He was embraced as a national hero, a symbol of Jamaica's unyielding spirit. In the generations that followed, Sharp's legacy only grew stronger. Monuments were raised, stories retold, and his image preserved in the collective memory of a nation. Schools, streets, and institutions would one day bear his name, not merely as markers of the past, but as reminders of what it means to stand for justice, even in the face of overwhelming odds. For the people of Jamaica, Sharp was not a distant figure of history, but a living testament to resilience, faith, and the enduring pursuit of human dignity. His journey from deacon to revolutionary, from prisoner to martyr, captured the contradictions and complexities of an era defined by struggle. He embodied both the pain of oppression and the unbreakable strength of the human will. To tell his story is to understand that history is not only shaped by those who hold power, but also by those who dare to challenge it with nothing more than courage and conviction. Sharp's life and death remind us that some voices cannot be silenced, even by execution. His spirit became a rallying cry, and his vision of freedom seeped into the soul of a people who would carry it forward long after his body was laid to rest. In the end, Samuel Sharp was more than a man of his time. He was the embodiment of hope, a symbol of resistance, and the quiet, steadfast hero who helped bend the arc of history toward justice. In the end, the Christmas Rebellion of 1831 stands as a testament to the power of human determination. Even when faced with overwhelming odds, though it failed to achieve immediate military success, the echoes of its defiance carried far beyond the sugar plantations of Jamaica. The courage of Samuel Sharp and those who stood beside him forced the British Empire to reckon with the growing moral, political, and economic impossibility of sustaining slavery. Within just a few short years, their sacrifice contributed directly to the passage of the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, which began the gradual dismantling of the institution across the colonies, culminating in full emancipation by 1838. But history reminds us that freedom is rarely given, it is fought for, demanded, and won through perseverance. The Christmas Rebellion was more than an uprising. It was a call to humanity's conscience, a reminder that justice delayed can never silence the human spirit. For the enslaved in Jamaica, the price of resistance was steep: countless lives lost, families torn apart, and scars both physical and emotional that would last generations. Yet, in those flames of rebellion, a path was forged toward a future where the dignity of every person could no longer be denied. Today, when we look back on those days, it is not the defeat that resonates most, but the legacy of hope that survived. Sharp's last words, proclaiming his faith that slavery was wrong and that freedom would come, became a prophecy fulfilled. His execution may have silenced his voice, but it amplified his message, inspiring both his contemporaries and future generations to pursue justice with unwavering resolve. That is why his name endures, not as a reminder of loss, but as a symbol of resilience and triumph. The story of the Christmas Rebellion challenges us to reflect on the meaning of courage. True courage is not found in victory alone, but in the decision to resist injustice even when success seems impossible. It is in this lesson that Sharp's legacy continues to inspire movements across the world, wherever people rise to confront oppression and inequality. As we bring this journey to a close, I want to thank you for walking through history with me, revisiting the courage of men and women who risked everything for a freedom they might never see. Their story reminds us that the struggle for justice is timeless and universal. If you found this story meaningful, I would be grateful if you could like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who might also want to learn from the lessons of the past. Every click, every subscription helps us keep these voices alive and bring more forgotten histories into the light. And now, as the night settles in and the world grows quiet, may their story linger in your thoughts as a reminder of how far humanity has come and how much further we still must go. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. And until we meet again in the next story, I wish you peace, rest, and the sweetest of dreams. Good night.